Good evening, everybody. I am back. I am First Alert Chief Meteorologist Casanova Nurse here in the weather office of WTXL ABC 27 right here in Tallahassee. So if you're one of our nearly 40,000 followers on our WTXL Tallahassee page, whether you're local here in the state line or perhaps following from another place, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you will discover this feed of information about Hurricane Dorian. We'll be on for a few minutes up until about, a little bit before 10 o'clock. Maybe we'll cut it short just depending on the information that needs to be disseminated and questions that you may have. So I'm taking a little time, as I have the last few nights, to address the latest developments of the system, and it has changed quite a lot in comparison to just earlier this week when it came to a very immature or premature, I guess, phase of strength. Now Dorian is definitely at a more mature phase, no doubt about that, because now we can see a very clear, distinct eye, even in the blended satellite, a blend of some visible and infrared capabilities where you can still see some halfway decent detail at night, especially when it comes to a vibrant hurricane like what Dorian has become. The eye is almost a perfect circle, and the cloud deck is very symmetrical as well, with just these little feeder areas of clouds that are rotating into the center. So just in the last 6 to 12 hours, this has undergone an incredible amount of development and structure, and now it is a full-fledged Category 4 hurricane. At the top of the 5 o'clock newscast, it had just gone up to a major level, actually at 2 o'clock, and then further strengthening had occurred at the 5 o'clock level. But now we are looking at a peak wind speed of 130 miles per hour around the center of Dorian, and still a good distance away from the east coast of the United States, and more specifically Florida. If you put a little measurement tracker on there, about 580 miles from roughly the southeastern coast of Florida to the center of Dorian. So it still has some distance to travel. However, it's moving more in a west-northwest fashion, and it's slowed down a bit in comparison to a couple days ago. West-northwest speed at 10 miles per hour, and the pressure has fallen to nearly 28 inches of mercury. And yes, there were some discussions last couple nights about inches of mercury versus millibars, which you may hear more often, especially in National Hurricane Center products. But either way you look at it, it's been a big drop in the air pressure over such a short amount of time. So no big surprise that we've had such an intensification trend as what has happened since the late afternoon hours. So that means there's high confidence that it could remain a major hurricane. It may go into some redevelopment cycles, but there's really not much in the way of atmospheric trends that would cause a big deal of weakening. It's just the overall physics of the huge spin, the overall mechanism of the hurricane itself, and it will have some redevelopment phases and cycles within the core that may make the system weaken just a little bit and then re-strengthen once that cycle is complete. So that's going to be the trend we'll likely see at least through the Saturday and Sunday time frame, because there's no land in its path until maybe it starts to interact with the northern and northwestern Bahamas. And then after that, it's forecast to slow down and eventually turn to the north. And that north turn is really the critical point that we've been relaying over the last several days. And this still is being shown more prominently in the actual official forecast that a north turn is likely. But where does it happen? It slows down as well. That could prolong some effects of this hurricane, even as intense as what's being forecast just off the east coast of the state of Florida. So you may be familiar with the Saffir-Simpson Scale, and that's what breaks down the hurricane into separate categories, 1 through 5. And if you followed hurricane tracking or hurricane weathercasts and other news coverage, you may be very well familiar. Category 5 is the strongest. Right now, Dorian is at Category 4, so it is an intense storm, no doubt about that. Just to rewind just a bit, it's on the verge of Cat 4. We'll have to modify those numbers. They may be off a little bit, but nonetheless, it is a major hurricane. Either way you look at it, and certainly going off of the indications that were given by the National Hurricane Center, Category 4 is definitely I'm going to step off just a little bit because there's a printout that I needed to get, and I just didn't get it earlier. Just to be absolutely certain, my volume faded a little bit as I walked away from the microphone. But nonetheless, 8 o'clock has wind speeds of 125, and then there was an update at 8:30 that found 130 mile per hour winds. So yes, that is definitely a Category 4. Just to clarify things, we may have to revise that little graphic that I showed there. But nonetheless, Category 4 is a certainty at its current level based on what the hurricane hunters had seen from their observations up in the air. All right, now that that's behind us and that's cleared out, hurricane warnings, none cover the state of Florida yet. And when I say that, I mean the coastal zones. I do believe that we'll start to see some advisories, tropical storm or hurricane watches going up somewhere along the Florida East Coast over the weekend. But for now, the hurricane warnings covering the islands of Grand Bahama as well as Great Abaco, Eleuthera. Those are in effect until further notice because hurricane conditions are expected within these areas of the northwestern Bahamas within 36 hours. A hurricane watch for the Andros Islands of the Bahamas, and that's for the expectation of hurricane conditions within 48 hours. So I'm sure preparations are underway. They've been through this sort of thing before, and eventually there will be some related advisories and warnings and watches for portions of the Atlantic coast of Florida. The factors haven't changed all that much. It's still the high pressure system that's across the eastern U.S. and the related steering flow with that, plus the system being over areas of warm water. It had avoided most of the upper terrain in the greater Antilles, so it did not get that little weakening punch that would have otherwise happened if it did go over mountainous areas. So there's limited upper level wind flow, the shear is light, the waters are warm, and we're seeing the effects of those with a thriving, building strong, very strong hurricane. Now that high is forcing Dorian to curve to the west. That means a closer approach to the Bahamas as well as over southeastern Florida's coast. And as it approaches, the mid and upper level steering flow does start to weaken a little bit. So that's going to force Dorian to slow down. And most, if not all, of the reliable models have been showing a slowdown, which is not great because it will extend the duration of the strongest winds and the huge amounts of rain that are bound to fall from the system, and it really could exacerbate the situation across the peninsula. But with the high moving out into the western Atlantic a little bit more, plus a minor little trough that may try to sneak in from the Midwest, those could be factors that create a more northerly turn, maybe sooner than we thought, especially when it comes to the slowdown that's anticipated, the movement of the high, and maybe some eroding of that ridge, and that could maybe cause it to turn to the north. So there has been that established trend for the last couple of runs that the hurricane could more than likely slow down, allow the high to do its thing, maybe get on the western side, and once that weakness starts to form with the slight movement of the high, that could allow a more northerly drift. So a slowdown is foreseen, and then a north turn. But the big question has always been where that north turn will occur. If it happens on essentially the right side of the cone, that's probably a good scenario for us here within the Big Bend region in southwestern and southern Georgia. A middle ground sort of turn where it kind of straddles the coast or maybe just coming inland, I'd say that's probably a medium impact for us, and also it could be favorable in comparison to a low chance for it to continue west and then move into the eastern Gulf and then turn to the north. I haven't seen many reliable products lately that would show that sort of scenario. It's not entirely impossible, but it's something that we should still consider even if it is a low risk, because that would mean it would cross the peninsula, maybe limited time over land, moving into a very warm trend in the eastern Gulf where the waters are even warmer than they are where it is now. So its intensification would certainly reoccur, and then a turn to the north would maybe pose a big risk for direct landfall within our area. Again, that's a pretty low end potential based on the forecast data that I've seen and the various models. Not really seeing much support for that, but it can't be discounted entirely. It's just a very low chance. The medium impact, as I mentioned, is if it crosses the coast and maybe hovers over the peninsula while it's moving north. That would promote further weakening, so it would not maintain Category 4 level for a lengthy amount of time, but it could certainly spread some gustier trends across our area once it approaches our region. But if it were to maybe stay just a little offshore, that would produce a lower impact for our area. So yes, there would be some rain, no doubt about that, especially in our eastern areas, but there wouldn't be so much of a wind impact. With this medium impact, which I still think is probably the most likely scenario based on what I know now, That will give us some periods of rain, maybe drier conditions near the tri-state counties, but in the Swanee River area and surrounding communities, there could be some times of gustier trends and maybe some periods of heavy rain. Now, it doesn't mean that even if it does stay offshore, that we won't get brushed by occasional breezes. The probabilities for tropical storm force wind gusts to be experienced around the state and even into Georgia are still around 30% or so in the tri-state area and climbing upwards of 70% within the Swanee Valley. And that's not to say you're going to get hammered by continuous tropical storm winds, but just the chances to experience those gusts will naturally be higher closer to where the center of the storm is. Almost a given across southeastern Florida from the Space Coast, the Treasure Coast, the Gold Coast, but a lesser chance as you move more northwest and become a little more detached from the central low. So that is a trend that will definitely be factoring into our own effects, likely on Tuesday and Wednesday. If we do get those effects from gustier winds and some more persistent rain, it's likely to be in the Tuesday time frame. And I know I'm talking a lot, and I'll definitely go back to the questions that you're posting so I can review some of them. And if I haven't addressed a question already, I'll certainly try to go back into the comments to see if there are any specific questions that I could possibly answer for you to give you a better understanding of what's going on. So it's right now in the western Atlantic. It's a little east of the Bahamas and moving west-northwest. So a west turn is already underway. It'll be around the northern and northwestern Bahamas over the weekend, late Saturday through Sunday, and then closing in on the southeastern Florida peninsula, most likely into your Labor Day, perhaps Labor Day later on and into Tuesday. It is expected to slow down. It will get stronger. That's already been occurring. And with a slower rate of movement with this system as it approaches land, there will be some higher potential for some significant flooding, let alone the gusty winds and very strong hurricane force winds that could happen, but certainly a higher flood risk. That could be a more widespread issue because so much moisture, so much rain can be deposited in such a limited space initially, but as it moves gradually to the north, it will spread that heavy rain threat across more of the peninsula in particular. Very warm ocean water. We've seen the effects that has had on its strengthening mode. And then the big question again is how persistent that high pressure ridge will be, where it will go, its rate of movement, and how its movement can allow the system to begin to move more to the north. So here's what we know, just to break down what we are very confident about and what we are not very confident about. We've already seen the intensification mode, Category 4 now, so it is staying above Category 3, and that sort of level is likely to be maintained through the duration as it approaches the Bahamas. We're highly confident in that northerly turn because the data tends to suggest very heavily that a north turn will happen. That has been projected for a few days. Now it's just a matter of ironing down when and where that turn occurs. And as it approaches the Florida Peninsula, it will have major impacts when it comes to high wind, especially in the eastern half along the Atlantic coast. There will be the storm surge effect with the wind blowing up perpendicular to the east coast. That's going to cause that rush of water towards those coastal areas. So storm surge will be a big problem. And as I mentioned, lengthy amounts of rain, very heavy rain naturally with a hurricane, but if it moves so slowly, you get multiple inches of rain through the duration, so that will likely prompt quite a bit of flooding concerns. Here's what we still don't necessarily know as far as precision goes with these three elements. We don't know the exact time or place of where that north turn will occur. It can occur east of the peninsula, which means the center would stay just offshore. If you remember Hurricane Matthew from 2017, it was one of those storms that just skimmed barely along the coast, but officially it stayed offshore. It never crossed over land in Florida. Or could it move more to the north after it crosses the coast, maybe moving north over the peninsula, kind of like Hurricane Irma from a couple of years ago. As I mentioned earlier, there's a very limited chance for it to cross all the way into the Gulf and then turn north. A low chance, less likely scenario, but not impossible if certain things come together, like if the high is slow to move or is pretty strong. Exact local effects. Usually the common question I get is, what will happen in fill in the blank with the name of the city. It's tough to say exact local effects right now, but essentially, if you live near the tri-state area, based on the current forecast, you'll have less of an impact. And perhaps when the center gets closest to our area, if it's staying far enough to the east, there could be little to no impact when it comes to adverse weather. If you're in our more eastern areas like Interstate 75, the Swanee River region, that's where we could see maybe more impact when it comes to rain and the occasional wind that could maybe reach tropical storm force. But exactly what level of wind, we can't really say right now. Just I would certainly expect, based on current conditions and current forecasts, that our eastern areas could be more prone to times of rain, maybe a few inches of rain, and perhaps some occasionally strong tropical storm force gusts. Likely to stay away from hurricane force gusts, but if some of the statistics tend to change and the model data tends to change, those can certainly be adjusted. Finally, another thing that we don't know for certain is where it will make landfall. Again, there's a chance that it stays offshore of the East Coast, but somewhere, I would guess, between the Space Coast, which of course would be the Cape Canaveral area, Merritt Island, Vero Beach area, Cocoa Beach, and then to the south. That's the most likely zone based on current information that we have. So those are some of the basics of Hurricane Dorian as we know it at this time. And of course, there are many tools that you can have in your arsenal or on your mobile device, and one of those tools that can keep you updated in case there are any local advisories that could be issued related to Dorian. You'll get them instantaneously once they're issued if you have our Storm Shield weather app. It's a free app. It is very useful. It is geo-focused, so you're not going to get warnings for every single location within Florida. You can set it to where it's only going to bring in notifications for your specific location. So download it and use it. Interactive radar, plus you can see the forecast tracks of Dorian with a layer that is available on Storm Shield, and again, that layer is free. So with all that talking that I've done, I want to get to some of the questions. I see there's about 3 dozen different comments, so I'll try to just scroll through and see some of the questions that are being posed and try to answer. And there's a diverse group, diverse geography, some folks from the local area, some folks from other states. So thank you for checking in on what's going on. I appreciate your interest in the information that we're going to give you over the next 10 minutes or so. Yes, as mentioned, it has changed its overall course. It was moving northwest over the last couple of days, now west to northwest. That trend is likely to continue as an effect of that high-pressure ridge to the north, so there's already been evidence of a more westerly path, still just north of due west, but that turn has begun, and that will bring it closer to the northwestern Bahamas over the next 36 to 48 hours. So that is definitely a trend that was expected, and now it's underway as it begins to make that turn. Betrinda asks if that high is still going to block it, or will it, or is it going to stall out over Georgia? It doesn't really seem like the high is necessarily going to cause it to stall over Georgia, but I do believe with the high to the north of the system as it is, and we'll go back to that graphic so you can see it visually. This is the approximate depiction of that high. It's beginning to move, and it goes up vertically as well in the atmosphere, but it seems like the lower levels of this high pressure system are really going to help to shove it in a westerly direction, and then some of those steering currents in the different upper levels will begin to back off some. They won't be quite as strong, so that's what's going to cause, that's our belief in what will cause the system to begin to slow down as it approaches the northwestern Bahamas and just off the east coast of Florida. So if it stalls, it's likely to be within this region here and not necessarily over Georgia, because I believe once it starts to turn to the north, it will begin to pick up some forward speed. But it could move very slowly over the peninsula, and maybe once it starts to reach the northeast Florida area and into Georgia, it will start to accelerate. That's a little bit beyond reliable forecast projections, so we'll have to monitor the trends accordingly to see if that will change or if that slow movement may carry north even into southern Georgia. So that is a concern, a legitimate question. Don't have an exact answer for that, but it is believed that once it starts to move to the north, it may start to pick up some speed and then continue on to maybe a north or northeasterly path. So that is a possibility, and that is one trend that we'll watch over the weekend when some of that data for the early part of next week becomes a little clearer and going into the middle of next week as well. Jamie is asking, do you think there is a likelihood it could spin off and not hit land? And there is that possibility, especially if the high weakens on its western side and moves a little farther to the east. That would give it a little bit of a channel in which Dorian could maybe just stay offshore. And that's what some of the late afternoon and evening forecast trends are trying to suggest, that maybe it could just parallel the coast by just staying offshore a few miles. But it leaves very little room for very little margin of error when it comes to that. It will be close enough to still have some direct impacts on the East Coast, and if it were to do that, then we would have to be concerned about the Georgia coast and into the Carolinas, where they could have more of a direct impact from this and the onshore flow that would certainly enhance any sort of storm surge or flooding risks there. So it may be a good situation for us here in the state line if it stays offshore. But it would help to focus hazards elsewhere in places where hopefully they are aware of what's going on, but not really welcoming any sort of hazards. I do think, Joe, asking about the ridge holding out, it's moving in now. A lot of the projections have been showing it reaching its strongest points between now and Saturday or Sunday, and then gradually shifting. Maybe eroding the western side of the high a little bit more thanks to a weak little upper disturbance coming out of the Midwest. So there's a good level of confidence that the high will be around, and at least increasing confidence that the western side of that high will weaken a little bit to allow a more northerly turn. The timing is the issue with that. We just are not exactly certain when that evolution of the high will occur, but there are leanings that it could take place over the Sunday-Monday time frame, and we could notice at least a northerly jog or a northerly push move of the high of Dorian by that time early next week. So we will monitor that closely, but there is still the higher confidence that a north turn will occur. It's just a matter of where and when. Can it strengthen to a Cat 5? It certainly could, Sheena. It would likely have to stay offshore, and we would have to have the perfect setup for it to do that. Right now, it's not forecast to reach Category 5, but it could come close. We saw a dramatic drop in the air pressure based on the reconnaissance observation data from the aircraft. So that was one example of a quick deepening of the low, which corresponds to an increase in strength. And if that does occur in cycles, we can start to flirt with the higher side of Cat 4. It would not surprise me at all if that occurs before it reaches the Bahamas. So that is a possibility as well. Going through a few more of the questions, really do appreciate those who are asking. Another Cat 5 question. Again, it has intensified rather dramatically tonight, and it's still over very warm water, and the upper winds are light. So having some more fluctuations in its strength going up, having an internal cycle of its eye wall, and maybe losing a little bit of strength and then regaining it in those little redevelopment cycles is certainly a possibility. So I think we'll kind of flirt with high 3, mid-end 4, maybe even pushing it on the upper side of Category 4 over the next couple days. And then when it starts to get closer to land, that could have even some weakening effects, which may cause it to drop off. But over the Bahamas, it's limited land coverage there. So I think it will be a minimal amount of weakening if it were to interact with some of the islands there. We'll put on the track in case some folks are more concerned about the categories, the movement, as well as some of the approach into some of our own local areas, which is possible, and we'll just show the full track like that, at least the relevant parts when it relates to Florida, because I don't want folks to think that it's going to be Category 4 all the way up in this region. However, it's important to note, based on this forecast, which will change in an hour, the 11 p.m. update will come out from the National Hurricane Center, usually a little bit before the 11 o'clock hour, so we'll see a revision to this track. But it is still, if it rides up the I-95 corridor, and again, I say that with caution because it could be anywhere within that space, but if it just straddles the coast, the weakening trend would occur, but it may be slow just because there is that close proximity to water, but it will still encounter the friction of land. So a faster weakening would likely happen if it were in the middle of the state of Florida, and probably limited to no weakening if it stayed just off the coast. So that's the difference there. And of course, the exact track, which cannot be defined right now that far ahead, where it goes north, whether it's over the water or over the land, will really determine what rate of weakening occurs. Over land would be most ideal to accelerate the weakening process in that case. Renee is asking, is there another system off of Africa? There is a wave. I don't have it in this suite of graphics. Actually, maybe I do. We'll point that out real quickly. In fact, I think this is one that Reed did earlier this morning. Essentially the same. There's just a disorganized wave coming off of West Africa. There is a zone within 5 days once it moves to the west of the Cape Verde region that can have some development potential. Longer range projections showing this staying out to sea. So technically, yes, there is another wave out there, but it's not another named storm, and it's not even a depression at this time. But it's that time of year where systems tend to form in this region and they move throughout the Atlantic. So we do have to keep that in mind, and it's a worthwhile thing to point out that once Dorian is done and over with, it doesn't mean there's not going to be any more, but at least we're not in a hyperactive mode of tropical storm or hurricane development at this point. Dorian is the only one, and there could be another that forms perhaps about a week from now, but we'll see. Really appreciate those who have given comments and asking questions. Amy, thanks for asking that, because quite honestly, I am tired for a number of reasons, not just for tracking the hurricane, but it's been a long week, and I plan to sleep tonight, at least try to get 8 hours worth, but I do have to be up in the morning to tend to some calls and track things from home, and Reed will be here, and he'll provide another streaming update on our main news page. So I will get a break, at least for a short time, and I'll hopefully be able to sleep very well. But I appreciate your concern about that, and hopefully this information will help folks who are watching sleep a little easier, even though we're not in the clear by any means here in the capital region, the Swanee River area, southern Georgia too. We still have to be on guard and be aware of what's going on, but hopefully this will maybe give you a little more ease that we're not necessarily facing the brunt of this storm like we did last year with Hurricane Michael, but there can still be some adversities that we face. All right, a couple more questions, as I know, folks, it's Friday night. You may not want to listen to a discussion about a hurricane for much longer. You may have plans, whether that's going out with your friends or maybe just going off to sleep. We'll start to wrap things up pretty soon. Elise is asking if there's any local rain anticipated ahead of the FSU game. Yes, there is. It's not going to be directly from Dorian, but we will start to have more of an east wind pattern that will set up a moisture feed a little bit more than what we had for today, and that will help to bring in our rain chances once again for tomorrow. Most of my graphics here in my lineup are based on tropical stuff. I don't think I have anything that's really focused in on a local perspective, but I do think I can at least show a quick radar screen to give you an idea. And as that graphic loads, I'll give you just a little preview of what's going on now and what may occur in the future. There's actually the satellite and radar, so that's a good perspective there. Dorian is over here, so the moisture that we have in the Atlantic now is not connected to Dorian, but that high will put us in a position to where east winds take over, and it will displace the dry air that we had and bring in that more moist air that's been lingering just to the south and to the east of the region. So that's going to be the source of tomorrow's rain chances if you're going to Doak Campbell Stadium for that relocated FSU Boise State game. There will be at least a few passing showers, I would believe, into the afternoon. It's likely going to be come and go, not too widespread, but it could be locally heavy if a shower does pass over the stadium at just the right or wrong time. So there is a moisture return that will contribute to rain chances tomorrow, but don't be afraid that's the onset of hurricane conditions, because that's not what it's going to be. It's simply just the return of the typical moisture setup that we have during the summertime, and that will lead us to get in on a few rain chances. So if you're making those tailgate plans or heading to the game yourself, you might want to have the poncho, because there could be some rain off and on. I think one more question. So Renee is asking about the cone, and that there's a 2, which indicates Category 2 level of strength. Now, yes, there will be some variability, and I do suspect that this will change. This does not mean across this entire line it would be a Category 2, and if it were on this left side of the cone, there would be a Category 2 hurricane in Tallahassee. That's not precisely what that means, but based on at least this positioning, there could be at least slow weakening, and very similar to what happened with Hurricane Michael, which made landfall officially as a Category 5. It maintained Category 1 level strength when it went all the way up to Albany. So that's I may not be very good at estimating distance, but over about 150 miles inland, it was still a low-end hurricane. So maybe that sort of strength, maybe not Category 5 strength, but a strong hurricane moving just barely inland will take some time to weaken. So having a Category 2 within that region or within this zone is not out of the realm of possibility. So that is something we have to consider. But also keep in mind that the strength projections will change depending on the future runs of forecast data. So this may go up or down just depending on what the projections are over the next several days. So it's valid to be concerned about the strength of Dorian if it comes close to our North Florida counties. And that's definitely one point that we'll be monitoring closely as well. That's why I do believe we'll still have some times of breezes. It may not be Category 2 strength wind across our local area, but it will be close enough based on this to where we can encounter some breezes going into Tuesday and especially on Wednesday. But just keep in mind that the positioning of this forecast cone will change, and as it changes, our expectations for local impacts will be adjusted. So Tuesday, Wednesday, to wrap things up, I think that's the prime time where we have to monitor for any of the peak effects that we get in relation to the storm. Peak as in, what's the strongest we can get, and not necessarily the strongest that the storm will get, because high confidence, again, that it will stay near South Florida or Southeast Florida and maybe riding up the coast, but if it moves over the peninsula, it will weaken some. And that will reduce the strength of the storm once it gets closer to here, but we'll still have some impacts. And I do have a little more confidence over the weekend that we can start fine-tuning local impacts more than just general statements of less action west, a little more east. We will be able to start to narrow down and give a few more specifics about local impacts. But it's definitely good to just keep in the back of your mind that Tuesday and Wednesday could be a little dicey in some cases. But that's still several days away, and we'll see how the trends go and how the system reacts and responds to its surroundings, and that will determine what impacts we get. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight here on WTXL Tallahassee's Facebook page for this session of updating you on Hurricane Dorian, its overall strengthening, its expected movement, and still the many questions that need to be answered so we can have a better clue as far as what to expect here. But enjoy your weekend. Yes, there will be some showers around, nothing major or severe and nothing connected to the hurricane, but we'll keep you informed nonetheless throughout the entire weekend as information is received and data is processed and new forecasts are released. We'll give you more analysis that can help you plan and be prepared. I'm Chief Meteorologist Casanova Nurse. I hope you enjoy your Friday night, and we'll see you again over the weekend.